very warm welcome from me to everyone as well on this somewhat chilly winter day. Look, I'm going to talk today about what we call the three phases of the COVID response from a broader macroeconomic perspective, and then tie that back hopefully to the property sector as we go along. But at Deloitte Access Economics, we talk about three phases: the respond, recover, and thrive. So respond equates to where we are now, recover, of course, the way out of the recession that we are now in, and then looking to thrive over the horizon. What's going to change? And of course, Andrew talked a little bit about that in his presentation, and I'll hopefully add a few more dimensions as we go along. But I think the thing that I want to start with this morning is to remind everybody that this is first and foremost a health crisis. So for those of us old enough to have lived through the 91 recession, which Paul Keating, Treasurer at the time, called the recession that we had to have, with the greatest of respect, this actually was a recession that we had to have. We could not afford to let the economy, let people go out and about without any restrictions. If you want to know what that looks like, just take a look at Brazil, Russia, and many of the other economies that are at the top right-hand side of this chart. What you can see over time is that many countries, through imposing physical restrictions — I like to call them physical rather than social, hopefully we remain socially connected — but those physical restrictions have had really good outcomes for those that have implemented them in terms of health. But of course, the economic consequences have been dire. Now, I don't want to bombard you with too much negative news, but I do want you to understand, and I think it's important, where we're coming from, so that you can then see what the pathway out looks like. And so we need to have some sort of that context. And in fact, just in the last 13 minutes, we had the May labour force numbers popped up. The unemployment rate only increased to 7.1%, and we saw last month it only increased to 6.1%, and that's because so many people have actually dropped out of the workforce altogether. But this is an ongoing problem, and I'll get more into the detail of that in a minute. But we need to be a bit careful sometimes in interpreting some of these statistics. But let's just go through a few anyway. And I think sort of the central points that I want to make are: services sector has been hit obviously the hardest. We've had exemptions for mining. Some manufacturing has continued with some distancing in place and some changes in measures. But you can see from the CommBank Purchasing Managers Index that on the services side, that pink line, very much seriously contracting, even though we're seeing some little comeback as restrictions start to be lifted, versus manufacturing. And of course, manufacturing is much less of an important sector in the Australian economy, being only about 7 to 8% of our economy, particularly in New South Wales. So not such an important sector for us. And unfortunately, that downturn, the really big hit to services, has really made our economy much more vulnerable because of our exposure, both in terms of the household services sector and, of course, business professional services, including financial services. You can see, some 74% of businesses are reporting to the Bureau of Statistics, the ABS, that they have in some way been impacted, had their revenues impacted. 72% of companies a fall in revenues, 22% down, and of course 7% up. It's an ill wind that blows nobody any good, and in certain sectors, particularly the infamous loo paper debacle, if you like, some sectors have seen their sales, in fact, go up during the course of this crisis. But it is very much a tale of several cities, and also, of course, different sectors. You can see on the left that, as we would expect, the arts sector, accommodation, hospitality sector, tourism are the ones that have been most affected in terms of job losses from the payroll data. But you can see that nobody or no sector has been untouched. And before somebody asks why information media and telcos is down, given how much extra streaming services and bandwidth we're all using, that's because the media sector also includes film and television. And obviously those production style houses have been very adversely affected as well, not being able to produce our favourite shows or a great deal of content, in fact, has been stalled. If we have a look at the map of Australia on the right side of this chart, for those of you that can see, we note that New South Wales was most heavily affected in the March quarter, and you can remember that this is before we saw the really big impacts from COVID, which we won't see until we get that June quarter data. But of course, New South Wales was already being adversely affected by both droughts and then bushfires, and then got the triple whammy of the COVID. So talk about a perfect storm. Where we really have seen some devastation to that economy. Clearly, that's the worst hit. Interesting to see in the Wild West that they've almost seceded from the rest of Australia. That even though they've been adversely impacted, of course, in the tourism sector, the role of mining in keeping that state going has been critically important. Other states much more vulnerable to tourism and of course the services sectors more broadly. There are lots of things that we weren't able to do for several months, but of course now we're starting to see the economy starting to open up, and we're hearing a lot of people talk about green shoots. And so whilst I would equate this COVID crisis a bit like a hurricane. Yeah, when you're in the eye of the storm, there's devastation everywhere. The storm itself might pass through quite quickly, and certainly we have lifted restrictions much more quickly than anyone anticipated. The health outcomes have been far, far better than the sorts of modelling that we were looking at back in March, which were really dire. If we were going to end up like the US, it would have been absolute a catastrophe for us. But barring a second wave, we've come out of this much more quickly. But as with the hurricane analogy, even once the storm passes, we might still see for quite a while the tail end of rain and wind. And then, of course, even once that might calm down and the sun starts to come out, there's still a massive cleanup to do, and that can take months and months. And that's much the same as what we're seeing with this crisis. Even though the worst of restrictions appears to be over, we will still have fallout consequences for quite some time before we get back to normal. Deloitte Access Economics modelling suggests that we will not get unemployment back to normal levels, including getting people back into the workforce, not just recovering the number of the unemployment rate itself, but recovering those nearly 1 million jobs that have been lost. Will take probably 4 to 5 years to get back to full operational level. And in fact, some sectors may never come back because, as with many parts of COVID, previous trends that were underway have been accelerated. Things like online, the way we communicate. Andrew already talked about how we have more flexibility embedded, not necessarily everybody working from home 7 days a week or 5 days a week, hopefully, but definitely concur. I know my young team are the ones that are most desperate to get back into the office and have that collaborative spirit. And as part of my work in urban economics, we talk about and can measure the benefits of agglomeration, those casual bumping experiences that create fantastic ideas, better collaboration, the ability to read body language. It's really important for people to have that physical connection. So Zoom is great and great for these sorts of opportunities to keep talking to people, keep up that social connection. But we look forward to seeing things come back to normal a little bit more as we go on. But as I said, some of these trends that have been accelerated, particularly around the use of technology, thinking about agricultural sector, manufacturing and mining, those sectors are seeing potentially long-term structural adjustments in employment, and we're likely to see more employment in services sectors, which means we've got to be really careful in thinking in the future about our vulnerability, not just to perhaps more frequent pandemics, but also obviously the consequences of climate change. But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself here, and I'll just jump back to those green shoots that I mentioned. And it is good to see that both business and consumer sentiment are responding positively to the lifting of restrictions and the greater flexibility in movement that we're all starting to be able to enjoy. Some, obviously, states and territories more than others, but we're starting to hear about border restrictions either about to be lifted or potentially being lifted a little bit further down the track. South Australia, of course, heading the pack with those lifting in restrictions. But I would caution again, we have seen some increase in community transmission. Yet another case from the Melbourne protests the other weekend. We're seeing in China now a second wave, in parts of the US, a number of second waves there. Whether they're related specifically to protests or not, we don't know at this stage, but certainly that won't have helped. And if Australians get a little bit too lax, we've suppressed the virus, we have not eliminated it. And if we do get into the stage where we start to get a rapid rise in figures, we need to be watching in the coming days to just make sure that we keep that under control, and we don't need to see, not so much, I don't think, restrictions imposed at the level that we had a couple of months ago, but potentially a much slower way out, and a much longer trajectory, if you like, before we get to the full stage 3 lifting of restrictions. But getting back to those green shoots and that little sign of positivity, of course, we've had so much support from government, whether it's monetary policy and financial system stability from the Reserve Bank of Australia. We're going to see interest rates, low for long. They've been very clear in signalling that you shouldn't expect interest rates to rise. Not so good if you're a retiree, perhaps relying on some of that. But for those of us that are net borrowers, that will be, help to stimulate demand as confidence grows. Obviously, tremendous amounts of policy from federal and state governments, and also less official support in terms of the banks and what they've been doing in terms of mortgage and debt holidays, property owners in terms of rent holidays. Now, those are going to come back, talking about, the hurricane effect and things that are still lie ahead of us. Come September, when some of the majority of government support goes, banks start to reassess the way they've addressed, put those holidays in place, the way some of the rental holidays come off. That's going to have some adverse consequences again. So, whilst I wouldn't quite call it a double dip, we should be cautious, and we can very well expect that come September, the data might look a little bit better as we approach September, but then in September quarter itself and those coming months, we're probably going to see a little bit of a 2 steps forward, 1 step backwards, as we adjust and pull away that tremendous amount of support that's been happening. And of course, we've just seen figures out on the last day on international travel, with no net migration of any consequence, and with probably an even further decrease in the natural birth rate. That's going to have big consequences, not just for the construction sector, although housing and construction will definitely feel the brunt of that, particularly as we get towards the end of this year and pipeline starts to run out, but also just generally for the population serving sectors, those service industries. Again, they're going to have much slower growth because, of course, population growth is a core part of our economic growth story in Australia. So again, some little words of caution. Yes, the green shoots are there, but I keep saying, just beware. Now, the IMF and the OECD are telling us we're probably going to have something of a good bounce back. I know the IMF is about to readjust their more recent forecast, and it's not going to be so V-shaped. And in fact, Deloitte Access Economics forecasts we've actually got what we call a question mark shaped recovery, because a lot depends. At the moment, it looks like we're somewhere towards the left of this chart. We've got the good, the bad, and the ugly, somewhere between the mild and harsh scenarios. I am a bit worried about, with how businesses are and their plans for investment. but probably a little bit more optimistic about the consumers, and certainly what we've seen in terms of retail spend. The credit card data that's coming out looks like a lot of sectors are coming back. But we still have obviously higher levels of unemployment. And as I said, once those government support levels come off, even if you're going from, JobKeeper to job seeker, that's still a couple of $100s a week less that you're going to have. And if job seeker gets cut back more towards New Start levels, which I certainly hope it won't, but seems quite likely that there'll be substantial reductions, that's going to be an even further decline in income for a lot of households. And we know that basically those things have been what's keeping retail going. Those payments and the stimulus payments, in addition to JobKeeper and JobSeeker, are the things that have been driving spending in the shops at the moment. So you can see that even with a reasonable scenario, we're still looking at contractions of somewhere around 5% this year. If we get the second wave, we get increasing social unrest, businesses become even more concerned and pull back their expenditure, then it could be a much heftier decline. But at the moment, things are, touch wood, looking a lot more optimistic than they certainly were. And conscious of time, I'm not going to talk too much about the future, because I think Andrew covered a lot of these things. But one of the things I do keep pointing out to people, I know COVID is everyone focused, but there are a lot of lessons around COVID from a sustainability and climate change point of view, and understanding future risks from climate style disruption. And it's something that the property sector is going to really need to think about in the future, and just exactly what those sorts of risks look like. And of course, finally, just talking about, we've heard the government talk about some of the policies that we expect to change in the coming year: industrial relations, the need for better skills training, more focused, cuts in red tape, and of course, taxation. Are these things going to be productivity enhancing? Are they going to be genuine reforms? It'll be interesting to see. I remain sceptical, but a little bit of cautious optimism, particularly around industrial relations, given there's been a bit of détente there between business and the union sector. So let's hope that we can see something positive there. And of course, then, the government is going to need to stay involved in the sector. We heard the Prime Minister on Monday talking about big infrastructure spending as well as smaller regional projects. We're very much in favour of those shovel-ready small regional projects as a way to help the property construction sectors to keep going as they face difficult times ahead. We're going to need to see more of that in the future. Thanks very much.
Look, fantastic insights into the broader economy, Nicki. Thank you very much. And at Charter Hall, we're always interested in hearing from experts like Nicki, because it does help shape the strategy of the group, the type of assets which we look at over the longer term. Nicki, we probably just have time for one question here. We've got a question from Lisa, who said, you mentioned interest rates are lower. What do you think the implications are for them being lower for a long period of time?
Yeah, well, obviously the biggest implication is around asset prices and people seeking higher yields. And it's kind of interesting, I think, what we're going to see. We've seen obviously the equity markets really look to try and grow to keep recovering those losses, and to find the goods story coming out, because they're trying to compensate for those lower yields and from interest rates. But it's possibly they're getting a bit ahead of themselves. I think one of the good things for Australia is in terms of the residential sector, is that it will help that sector when we've got so many other forces potentially seeing not only new activity, but also general demand and prices facing some softening trends. So there's going to be a real chasing of yield, and that will continue to happen for a long time. But it's a good thing for governments facing debt. It means that we should be borrowing more on the infrastructure front, and that's good. And it also means that for the corporate sector, who often are quite cautious around what the return on investment might look like for their investment strategy, it's certainly that lower cost of capital is a positive.
Well, look, thank you again, Nicki. Really appreciated your time today.